to Resetting the Record.
Welcome to Setting the Record Queer, a podcast where queer people talk about the pursuits and communities they love. This is Resetting the Record, a special episode where we revisit old topics with new guests, number 1, and it's about retro technology and computing. My name is Alexis, my pronouns are it, its, and she, her, and I'm one of your hosts.
My name's Kaylee, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm your other host.
It's like 2018 all over again, Kaylee.
Oh no, not again! It's not even going to be 2019 for very long when you're listening to this, or if you're listening to this at any point in the future, it's probably 2020 if you're not listening to this new.
Yeah, that'll be nice. But yeah, so this is Resetting the Record number 1, and we are going to be revisiting our topic from Setting the Record Queer episode 2, which was retro technology and computers with Gravis Lizard. So if this is a topic that very much interests you, or even if it isn't, I highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode. This isn't exactly going to be like a sequel where you need to know every detail, but there are certainly references going to be made and such. And also, Kaylee and I listened to it in preparation for this episode, and it was a good time. So I just recommend listening to it if you haven't in general.
Yeah, it held up a lot better than I was expecting it to.
We were both afraid, but it turned out honestly pretty fine.
So, yeah, let's get back into, we're gonna keep format pretty similar to normal with a few twists here and there. So let's start by, like, what have we done since the last episode? Because I did that Soul Sync stream I promised a couple, episodes ago. It was pretty good. There's a video, you can go watch that. If you're interested in that, you should go watch it. It'll be in the show notes.
It was cool. I didn't watch it because I've been watching Kaylee develop Soul Sync for months and months and months and have seen everything that she demoed as it was being built. But from what I overheard from the other room, it sounded like she was having a good time. So
I was.
Other things, and this is totally something that's happened in the past. You should listen to the Taking the Minutes that went up last week that I did on text painting and music. I'm sure it was great. I've totally recorded it already and haven't been procrastinating at all whatsoever, despite the fact that it comes out in like maybe 36 hours or so.
It comes out last week, Alexis.
Time continues to be confusing. 36 hours from when I'm recording this, I need to have had recorded that. Grammar is also just as confusing as time, as it turns out. Kaylee, please save me.
What else have we been up to? I've been making Alexis watch this Netflix cartoon called Troll Hunters that was created by Guillermo del Toro. It's really good. You gotta give it like 8 episodes, but it's worth it.
Yeah, the first 8 or 9 episodes are kind of trash, and then there's just one episode, and you'll know when you get to it, where the show is just suddenly amazing, and it does not slow down after that. We just started season 3, and I'm very much enjoying it.
Other than that, Alexis, I asked Gravis to come back on the show, and he told me never again, and then started, and then ran away very, very quickly. I
didn't realize that this happened.
Yeah, please tell me that you were able to find someone else to take the mantle.
Yeah, actually. What's really funny about this particular Resetting the Record, I think, though this may be the case for future Resetting the Records as well, as this is the first one, can't get much earlier than doing the topic from episode 2, is that both of the people we're going to be talking to today actually came up in that episode. So for the sake of continuity, I would like to introduce them as Gravis did. So with us today, we have Foone Turing, whose life is very squarely defined by their love and interest in retro technology, and Gewt, who owns and programs at least 7 vintage phone systems. So, hello, friends.
Hello.
I hope those titles were accurate. I mean, they're a year old, so...
Is it still 7?
I feel like it's more.
I think it's a little bit more now. I have a lot.
Well, why don't you introduce yourselves?
I'm Foone Turing. My pronouns are they, them.
Hi, I'm Madeline Autumn Rose, or Gewt. My pronouns are she, her. Hello.
And you both like retro technology. Woo! I'm excited to do this episode. This is a topic that I personally have a very strong interest in. So I'm excited to see where this goes. Also, every time I tweet something vaguely related to retro technology, Foone retweets it, and then it gets like 100 more. So consider this a form of payment, I suppose. Best I can do, anyhow.
Yeah, I think a large portion of my job on the internet is to find people who do really interesting things and then retweet them, and then they DM me like a couple days later like, why did I get 8 billion views? I have followers, I'm sorry. It's Elon Musk's fault.
Okay, we have questions we need to ask, but I need to ask about that one first.
Yeah.
Okay, so about a year ago, maybe a little longer than that, I was really bored at work, and I'd been reading some interesting stuff on Wikipedia about how the human vision system works. And a large part of my appeal is that I will rant about interesting stuff I read on Wikipedia, basically. So I'm like, here's some neat things about an element. Here's why hafnium is important.
I love Foone's element threads. They're great.
Yeah. It's something about taking a big topic and digesting it into tiny little pieces makes it interesting. And I have ADHD, which means that's the only way I can write, but it also means that's a good way for me to read. So I think other people with similar sort of mental situations like it that way. But yeah, so a year and a half ago, I was bored at work and I started ranting about how the human visual system is kind of weird, and it's weirder than we expect. Like, it lies to you about how much time passed, because every time you move your eyes, you basically go blind, because you can't see while your eyes are moving. But instead of basically not showing you anything or lagging and showing you what you saw before you looked, it actually shows you what you see after your eyes finish moving, but time stretches it backwards so that you think you saw it earlier than you did. This is why if you look at a clock that's an analog one with a moving second hand, the instant you look at it, that second seems to take longer, because that second is actually being time stretched backwards. Because your brain, rather than do any kind of the sensible computer vision things you'd think it would do, just lies about how long time is. And this thread got so insanely popular that Elon Musk followed me for a week, and a bunch of terrible people retweeted me, and I got about 20,000 followers in a month. So yeah, I had a lot of interesting responses based on that.
I do remember that thread. It was a good time, and I think about it a lot, so thanks for that.
I don't think I saw it, but my head hurts now.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that's Foone's anime backstory, but let's get into the questions that we actually planned to discuss. So I guess we'll take this sort of one at a time, and whoever wants to go first can feel free to. So let's talk about, we have this very broad envelope of retro technology and computing that the assessment I gather from the number of folks in this sphere that I follow is that everyone has their own thing or things that are really theirs. So for each of you, what does your specific interest encompass? Is there a date range or a tech type or anything otherwise specific that makes your identity in this community unique?
For me, it's mainly been an interest in floppy disks. That's kind of been my defining characteristic. And there's been a lot of sort of spreading out into adjacent areas. And, I've got a lot of random other side interests, but the big one that kind of got me started on this whole retro tech kick that I've been going on for half a decade now has been sort of floppy disks. And part of it was just an author I like, Charles Strauss, had retweeted how he had this one obscure Zenith computer which used a 2-inch floppy disk. And it's like, that's weird. I've never seen those. Turns out it's because one computer that didn't sell very well used them, nothing else. And they're really tiny and cute. And I was like, wow, I wonder what other things there are that are out there that I don't know. And I just kind of started researching it. And it turns out that there's a lot more of the computing history than you remember. And then a lot of it has shown up on eBay since then. So if you get on eBay, you can find a lot of interesting things, and that often leads down weird rabbit holes. So I kind of started, digging into things and collecting strange things and finding more and more odd things as I sort of just kept digging into that.
And then in my case, I think my main primary focus has pivoted from more vintage computing stuff into phones and telephone systems. There isn't necessarily a specific age or type that I'll focus on. If it is businessy and does phone, I will probably have an interest in it, which like I said, I have a lot of different phone systems. They all interoperate with each other. They all communicate with each other. It's just a fascinating experiment trying to make them all talk to each other, because they're complicated, easily defined systems that can operate together. So it's just a fascinating challenge making them all work together.
How many phones would you say per room in your house you have on average?
My bedroom has 5 at least. The living room is currently somewhere around 3. I believe Foone's room has 2. And that's not counting all the ones in storage. I have a lot of phone systems and phones.
Storage.
Yeah, I probably could have called in this chat from my room using our internal phone network, and it might have worked better than this.
I considered it.
It would have been appropriate, but it probably would have caused headaches.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't have sounded very good.
Oh no, my network has perfectly good sound quality.
Well, I would also be using a rotary phone from the 50s, which probably would have increased the quality a bit.
Oh, carbon mics.
So, I guess let's go back to the beginning for a second. How did you get interested in these things in the first place? And how long have you been doing the various things you do with these? Researching, collecting, programming, rebuilding, writing about, etc. And, this is a question we asked to Gravis back in episode 2, and he kind of gave a general answer about how it's very much the stuff you grew up, or the stuff you almost grew up with, the stuff that was really cool that someone a little older than you got to use. Would you say that this kind of lines up with your experience, or is yours a little different than that?
I think that's definitely a large part of it, because I think some of the things I've, learned about that are the most interesting are the things that were kind of on the periphery of what I knew, like stuff. I had a specific computer growing up, like a Packard Bell 46, but I, looked in magazines and they had all these fancy things and I had no money to buy them, so I never got to try them. And it's like, well, it's now, 25 years or 30 years later, and I can now get on eBay and get them relatively cheap and try them out. But I think actually beyond that, probably the most interesting things are the stuff I didn't know about in the time but was around. The stuff that failed or was obscure or, only in another country. Because it's like, this would totally have made sense in the world I grew up in, but I never knew about it. And that sort of oddness, I think, is a lot more interesting to me. I love to find out about something that was like a really neat, awesome idea for the 10 minutes that it made sense, but has completely vanished off the face of the world. Like, one example is I found out someone made something called a FISK, F-I-S-K. It's a fax machine for floppy disks. So you've got like a little number pad and a floppy drive, you put it in, you dial someone else's FISK, and it sends them all the data on that floppy drive. And it's like, wow, there was a time in like 1995 when this was awesome. But, it never went anywhere, and I never heard about it.
That is cool as hell, though.
And me, in my case, I didn't necessarily have the most interest in phone stuff growing up, but I got a lot of this from my grandfather, who worked for the phone company back when they were the phone company. So I guess it's just a familial interest. Like, in my case, haven't been doing this stuff for too long, maybe 4 years or so, but still long enough to figure it out a lot in a short time. Still learning things as well. So it's just, I don't know, I guess I'm a bit of an exception there. I'd always wanted to play with phone systems more, I guess. I always found them fascinating every time I would have to use one, and I was like, ooh, I wonder what kind of system this is. I wonder how I can play with one. I wonder what using one is like. And then after I used some of them later on, I realized, oh no, this was a mistake. These are utterly cumbersome to configure. I hate this.
And going off what you said about familiar interest, I often tell people that I learned all my love of computer from my grandmother, and a lot of people think that's a joke, because it's like, oh yeah, my grandma, she's all into computers. But she had a programming degree, and she, back in the 70s, was computerizing her industry. She worked in a shelvings company with my grandfather, and they were computerizing long before anyone else was. And this was a big, a big help for their business, because everyone else was not computerized. They're still doing stuff on typewriter. And she was like, oh no, we need to get a bunch of computers in here. And, doing things like, they were some of the first early adopters of digital cameras, and it's like early on, a lot of what I had to learn from computers came from her. Like, I remember, I went and bought some games, and I had one I could get working, one I couldn't, and I was like, well, my grandmother's going to come visit in a month or two, and she can tell me how to get that working. So, I learned a lot.
Well, did she get the game working?
Oh yeah, in about 30 seconds.
Nice.
It had instructions on the front that was like, just type A drive and then setup.exe, because this was back in the DOS era. And for some reason on that game, it didn't work right. Like, it would install and it would say, press 5 to play the game you just installed. And I pressed 5 and it didn't work. Although the funny thing about that is the other game, the one that did work, kind of worked. What actually happened was I knew how to install it, and then at the end of the installer it would let you play the game. I didn't know how to run it without installing it. So what happened was, every time I wanted to play the game, I installed it again. And it wouldn't let you install it over itself. So I ended up having to give it like a different file name each time. So by the time I finally learned enough about DOS to understand what I was doing, I had about 100 copies of the game installed on my computer.
Oh dear. Back at that time, I can't imagine that was good for your very limited hard drive space.
Oh no, I mean, that was probably, I believe I found out about this and had to learn about this because I'd run out of disk space, because 100 copies of Duke Nukem 1 was about all I could hold.
I had meant to ask this question towards the end of this segment, but since this just came up, I will ask this now. So, Madeline, you just mentioned you kind of got into this hobby about 4 years ago. What I was going to ask, is this something that someone can get started in today without the lifelong love? And if so, how can someone do that? But, well, it does seem like you have a lifelong interest in these phone systems. Actually playing with them seems relatively recent. So I guess, how is it different between, doing this lifelong and picking it up now versus kind of always having been looking into this stuff?
It's absolutely possible to just get into it now still. Like, you don't necessarily have to have a lifelong love or experience with it, because there's a lot of resources. They're kind of scattered, and there's a bunch of people that are releasing information on how to set up your own phone system, and proliferation of VoIP technology allows people to set up their own smaller phone systems and play with a lot of features that were previously limited to like big, large, expensive phone systems require very specific licensing agreements and whatnot, and advanced licenses. So it's becoming very accessible, and there's communities around this. They're kind of scattered and not always the greatest, but it is very possible to find good communities that are very good with great people as well, especially. But it's totally possible to just get into it still. There's a bunch of people, like I said, making articles and blog posts and documenting their processes, etc. So absolutely possible to get into it still.
So would your recommendation then be something along the lines of find someone else who shares that interest that you're looking to get into, and maybe look for their like research or process as like a jumping off point?
Yeah, I find that to be a pretty good starting point, because one, it gives you someone that is familiar with the topic, so it can sort of guide you through it and provide you with links to some of the scattered information, and that helps. But you can also do it yourself. It's just a little bit harder because, like I said, a lot of the documentation and articles and blog posts are kind of scattered. There's not really a centralized database or centralized community.
Yeah, I remember back in episode 2, one thing that came up quite a few times was Gravis struggling with Google to try and find these, like, old things that quote unquote nobody cares about anymore. He mentioned in particular that Google tries to help you by changing your search to find things that return actual results, which in this sort of sphere ended up being a bad thing. But having someone else's work to jump off from sounds like a good plan.
I can back up what Gravis said. I frequently have the problem where I find something and I search for it, and there's like 3 results, 2 of which are randomly generated spam, and the third is me talking about it before on Twitter. So it's like, I want to find more about this. And the only answer is, about a year ago, I was trying to find something about it.
Yeah, that sounds like trying to find weird things on the internet. So you both have, like, clearly very strong interests in your, like, retro technology topics of choice, but what do you do with these passions? Like writing or research or collecting? And this isn't sort of touched on, but if you want to go into a little more detail about, like, what it is you do to bring these things to the world, I would love to hear about that.
Well, like, one of the things I was thinking about early on was I was inspired by a lot of, like, YouTubers, like, say, Lazy Game Reviews, he's a great one, and then later on, things like TechMoan, Technology Connections, who find something interesting and old, do a bunch of research on it, present it in a nice way, and I was thinking, that would be cool, I'd love to do that. So I started, collecting some interesting stuff to do that on, and then that kind of never really happened, in part just for ADHD reasons. Like, doing a big, complicated thing is really difficult for me, but in the meantime, I'd post pictures on Twitter of, like, interesting things I found, or, like, here's some pictures I took of this thing I got that I might do a video on later. And it turned out that ended up being a focus on its own that I could handle. So a lot of it is basically just, I found an interesting thing, I'm going to take some pictures of it. I do a lot of things where I, have something, I tear it down, I just open it all up and take pictures and try to figure out what all the stuff inside it is. The kind of thing that other people like Big Clive on YouTube does as a video, I just do as, like, a Twitter thread. so that I can sort of try to show off these kind of things. And occasionally I do stuff where it's like, I've got some really odd things and I want to see if I can get them to work together kind of thing. I'm always on a weird quest to try to get relatively modern computers working with floppy drives for assorted reasons, which is quite complicated, that kind of thing. And that's often interesting.
In my case, what I do is I effectively have a dialable petting zoo of phone systems, more or less. Every phone system in the house can reach every other phone system in the house, and each phone system has its own external phone number. So you dial one of my myriad list of numbers, it reaches you into one phone system. You can play with its menus, reach its numbers, reach its phone system, or reach its answering machine system. It's designed for other people to play with. At one point, part of my system was helping a friend doing phone system security research. I used at one point in my system to lab up client configurations when I was doing telecom consulting. The goal is not to have a secret hidden network. The goal is to have a network that others can play with and explore and learn from.
Honestly, the notion of like a phone system petting zoo is super cool. So, to me, that almost sounds like you've got like a miniature phone museum in your house. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would call that pretty accurate. I definitely have my own phone network, that's for sure.
Do you ever just like dial one of the phones in your house and wait for Foone to pick it up and then go, Foone, come in here, I want to see you?
Yes, we've done that before.
Yeah. And that reminded me of a project we did together. I got a answering machine from the 80s, I believe. It's actually called a Duophone, Phone. And I have I've recorded onto a tape of it the song Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. And thanks to Madeline's help, it has an external phone number now. So you can dial in and get a nice recording. It's actually only the first minute and a half because it uses this weird format where it's like a loop tape. So I couldn't put the whole song on there. But yeah, you can call in. I'm not 100% sure it works right now. It's an old tape recorder, so it might be broken.
The last I remember, the motor for controlling the tape was starting to wear out or needs lubrication, so we'll need to replace that or lubricate it.
Yeah. Well, part of it was supposed to be like kind of an art project. As the thing physically wears out, because it's literally a mechanical motor, it's going to slowly get worse and worse. It's going to become vapor wavy as the tape stretches and the motors die.
Worse or better?
Yeah, both. Well, the first time I did it, I tried recording on a standard tape recorder, not realizing this one actually runs a little slower than a standard one, so it was kind of like Never Gonna Give You Up, instant vaporwave edition.
Okay, but do you ever actually just pet the phones? I mean, if it is a petting zoo, then do you pet the phone?
Absolutely. Every time I run past the Meridian cabinet, I tend to pet it.
Okay, great.
I keep an eye on it, make sure nothing has fallen on top of the poor thing, make sure everything around it is safe, it's getting enough airflow. I'm very passionate about that particular system. Yeah. It's the core of my phone network, basically.
And kind of treating things like a petting zoo is one of the motivations I had behind my floppy disk exhibit that I've done a couple times, like Finnish computer festivals, just showing you all the floppies, because one of the things about them that I find interesting compared to other computing technologies, these were always designed as like handleable, physical objects that people are going to put their hands on. Like, you think about like a CPU or a RAM chip or something, that just goes in a box somewhere and you don't touch it. But floppies were always supposed to be something you're supposed to carry around and touch and put into things. So it's like, they're interesting objects to pick up and hold because they're always designed to be used like that.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about your festival exhibits and stuff? I know that's something you tweet about fairly often.
Sure. I mean, basically the way it started out is, I just had collected most of the varieties of floppy disk, and I thought it might be interesting to show them off. Because one thing about them is that there's certain types that everyone remembers. Like, even if you weren't necessarily around and, all that old in the 90s or in the 80s, you remember 3.5-inch discs, because they had a kind of a long tail where they survived into the early 2000s. But then if you're a little older, you remember 5.25-inch. A little older than that, you remember 8-inch. Then you might remember zip disk, like a lot of people say they use those in college. But then it's those are 5 types out of the 30 or so, maybe more different types of floppies used. And it's most of those you didn't know about, or you only ever saw them in a magazine or, something like that. So being able to show them all is very interesting and let people sort of be oh yeah, I heard about those back in the 80s and I never saw one. And then I've got a lot of things that are just so obscure that there's 5 references to them on the internet. I've got one particular type of floppy that was only used in some Brother industrial sewing machines back in the 70s. And it's why did they think designing their own floppy disk was a good idea? I have no idea, but apparently they did, and it's really interesting that they did.
That's amazing. I can say from experience, after doing my rewriting the record this year on learning to sew, after having looked at a bunch of different sewing machines, I love that idea. That sounds amazing. I mean, not using a proprietary disk for it, but like floppy disk sewing machine, count me the heck in.
Yeah, I believe some of the later ones switched to the standard 3.5-inch floppy disk, which made a lot more sense, but I'm sure they made the file format proprietary as well, so...
So beyond those like festival presentations, and you've both mentioned other ways that you sort of present things, are there any like specific works of yours that you'd like to highlight, discuss on the podcast, anything of particular interest, whether of the subject matter or how you put together or presented it?
At one point, I wrote up this really neat Medium article just documenting the phone system I'd set up with like subheadings for various sections of it, detailing all the cards in the phone systems, including some pictures, indicating how I got everything to connect together, all the hardware I used, all the tools I used, that kind of stuff. And I shared that link around a bunch of people, and it ended up making it to Hacker News at one point. So that got my article quite a bit of attention. I guess it just wasn't expected that it would get even remotely popular. I just sort of wanted to write a nice personal article about my accomplishments and what I'd done over time and how I had interconnected things, because I just wanted to tell people because I was excited about it and I wanted other people to explore it. So I wrote up a nice little blog post on Medium and it got popular, I guess.
Did you have to like change anything about it when it started getting more and more popular, or did you just leave that Medium article out there for anyone who could digest it?
I left that article out for anyone, but I've been considering writing a second article where it fixes some of the issues of the initial one and details some of the further changes that we made, because there have been a lot of changes made since that post in 2017, I think it was. So there's been a lot of changes, a lot of new things learned, a lot of expansions, a lot of new interesting complications, a lot of new interesting issues that have come up along the way, a lot of new phone numbers, and a lot of new systems. So I just need to get around the time to making up a second article on it.
Now, and my big project that I'm pointing people to today is the Death Generator, which has a very scary name, but it's not really. Basically, one of the things I was always interested in as a kid was video games from Sierra. They did a lot of adventure games. And amusingly, the reason I played them was because of floppy disks. Because they did a thing back then where they would sell their games and they'd come on both 3.5-inch and 5.25-inch discs and put them both in the same box. The idea being that you might have either, and it makes it much easier to make sure you have the right one. But it meant that my friend who had only a 5.25-inch gave me all their 3.5-inch discs. So like, oh, free copy. So I got into them. But they always had these neat screens because they were super hard where it's like, you died. Next time, better be careful about that. So I built this little tool that kind of lets you mock those up, like pixel accurate, using the original font out of the game and, their little picture and everything. And then that just kind of kept growing. And it's now something like 120 different games where you can make various strains out of them, like, Mario 64, the letter you get at the beginning, or Metal Gear Solid codec screen, or Castlevania Symphony of the Night, that intro with, what is a man, and all that. It's just keeps growing as I just add more and more games. And in fact, today I've been working a lot on Hamtaro Rainbow Rescue, which has been my eternal, bugbear. Every time I see this game, I want to put it in the generator, and I've not been able to, and I think I'm finally going to be able to do it. So it's just a fun tool for making little memes. And one thing I've been really happy about it is that I've seen other people making memes with it. When you build something like this, where it's just like, hey, here's a tool, create something with it, you kind of expect that half the people who get it are going to be terrible. I'm really happy that I've not seen people making terrible memes. It's like, there's a thing where a bunch of people are using the one of, from Metroid with Samus Aran, saying, Samus hates TERFs, or Samus is a trans woman type things. And it's like, I'm so glad to see that and not a bunch of terrible, vile stuff put into the mouths of these video game characters using my tool. So that's my big tool, my big thing now.
Let's do a little fun listener contest this week. Not sure what we can actually. Well, maybe we'll post it on Twitter or something. But use the Death Generator and just try to make the funniest one by the time that we record the next episode.
That was some great, specific, helpful guidance there. I mean, that was about as specific as I'm sure the idea that came to your head 10 seconds ago was.
Yeah,
so.
it's great. Just make something funny.
Okay, here's my specific challenge, actually. What we'll do, I want you, go to the death generator and put a quote from the podcast, any quote from the podcast, literally anything in one of these death generators. Find the funniest pairing of quote and game you can think of and send it to us on Twitter or Discord. But Foone, do you want to talk? I think this might be an interesting way to get an idea of how this process sort of goes. And also, I've been enjoying following this. Do you want to talk about like why that Hamtaro game you mentioned has been so particularly difficult and what you've had to do to actually get it to work?
Okay, so when I'm making a generator, a lot of it like depends on what like system it is. Like NES games are often the easiest because the neat thing about NES games is they have a very simple like way to do tiles, and all the letters are aligned on 8x8 borders, so I can just pull up the game in an emulator, take some screenshots, go into like the view VRAM data, copy the font out of there. I've got some little tools to rearrange it, and I'm good. The problem is the GBA was this weird like point in technology where it became very easy to like pre-compose tiles in RAM as you were building them in order to make your fonts nice and proportional. And it's like later on this would have been easy for me to hack because I could just like change the RAM of the game while it's running. The GBA was at this perfect point of like the thing was fast but not with a lot of storage. So all the games are using like compressed fonts and compressed text. They're not using ASCII yet. It's just a huge mess of complexity. So, I search the video RAM of the ROM, and I can't find any fonts. I search the hex of the ROM. I can't find any text. I try to edit it in RAM. I can't do anything. So it's just been a brick wall. I was, looking into learning ARM assembly so I can try to disassemble the font routine for this game to figure out how to do it. But thankfully, while I was complaining about this for the 100th time, someone figured out that the game doesn't actually compress its text, which I thought it was doing. It's just not using ASCII, and the way I'd been searching for it was not finding it. So I had a partial translation table to let me figure out where some words were. And then once I know where a word is in the ROM, I can change it. So I basically repeatedly changed the text in the game so that it has every single letter in it one at a time. So I basically run the game 512 times, grabbing one letter out each time until I have the full font set out.
Huh. For a little bit of educational context there, ARM assembly is the lowest, or I guess the second lowest level of programming languages where you're actually working in the way the different parts of the computer talk to each other, sending values between CPU cores and things like that. ARM is one sort of language of assembly, and ASCII is a standard for text that most computers and other computing systems share.
Right. Interesting thing about this is assembly used to be the only way you could program computers back in the 50s, and then Rear Admiral Grace Hopper thought up the idea, hey, we've got computers, they're good at managing text and stuff, why don't we make them do this for us? And she came up with this idea of, hey, we'll build a program that takes what we type and turn it into assembly for us, and then we don't have to deal with this stuff, because it's complicated.
It was a good idea.
I don't know, I think we should still I think we should typewriter these episodes out and post them on the side of the local bulletin.
Ye old Victorian podeth casting.
We post it on a pod. That's why.
We just send out a little pods that just have just ye old medieval scrolls in them that have the podcast written out in quill ink.
Yeah, you have a yeller go to each town and go, hear ye, hear ye.
Hear ye, welcometh to the latest episode of Settingeth the Record Queereth.
Man, Liberty Sin's rates are ridiculous for shouting out all these things. I hope Pat Rion will help us fund our ventures. That was a terrible joke. Let's move on. So, what about a specific topic tends to get both of you interested when you see it and want to look more into it?
For me, I think a lot of it is obscurity, just sort of things that are not well documented yet. Because, one thing about the retro tech community, which is kind of, I think, probably better than a lot of other communities, is that a lot of these sort of obscure old topics, things you'd think would be obscure, a random computer from the 80s, have actually been delved into very deeply already. They're very well documented. We've got emulators and software and such around. So I think that's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it means if you want to jump into it now, it's a great time. You can pull up an emulator and get ROMs and, do everything. But if you want to, do some new research and do something interesting that no one else has done, there's a lot of spots that aren't really, available yet. It's we've already looked in all these dusty corners kind of things. So finding stuff that I can't find information about actually makes it more interesting and to me to go and to look more into it, because it's like, well, no one's talked about this yet. Why not? Why was this thing obscure? And it's, a lot of things, it's like, this was an interesting idea that didn't go anywhere. It was not a commercial success. Like, I like to talk about the capacitive electronic disc, which was this really cool idea to do, like, video on a record. And RCA had this idea in the 50s, and they were going to put it out, maybe in the early 60s. And if this had come out in the 60s, it would have changed the world. Like, this is prior to VHS and Laserdisc and all that. But it didn't. It came out in the 80s. Laserdisc and VHS were already out, so it was an also ran. But it's like, these were still very neat ideas, even if they weren't commercial successes. And then a lot of other times it's things where it's like, this was only used inside an industry, and stuff inside an industry is often the hardest to find out about, because it's like, these were never, like, sold to the public. So all the documentation basically was, there's a lot of things I have where it's like, I know about one ad in the back of a magazine that says, oh yeah, just call us up and we'll send you a pamphlet about it. It's like, no one got that pamphlet and scanned it, so there's no info about it. So finding these sort of obscure, odd corners always gets me interested, because it means I can start looking into it and trying to see if anyone else knows about this and contribute to the general amount of information in the world, basically.
In my case, it's a situation of I'll find a system, I want to know more about it, and I want to make it talk to my other systems. Do I want to, I want to learn how a system works. I want to learn its intricate details, its workflows, its underlying processor a lot of the time. A lot of time I'll also try and break out of its restricted environment and see if I can't get right down to the bare OS and play with that a bit. But I want all my systems to talk to each other, and I want to pretend that I'm some advanced phone network, where I even deploy telephone company terminology and assign, like, telephone company mocking identifier codes, and just pretend to be my own private little phone company, kind of. At one point, I even considered deploying a billing system so I could track calls and generate my own internal bills. Just how best to grow my system organically and overcomplicated. If it looks like it can be interesting business and overcomplicatable, I will definitely research it. I'll learn more about the system, I'll deploy it. Sometimes I've also done it because it's a cool company name, or because the system itself physically looks cool. Sometimes I just want to learn more about how a system works, period. So I have several like that. And there's also this one system I use just because I kind of hate it, because it's utterly cumbersome to configure. The user interface is awful, and the documentation is kind of wrong. So there are some like that, which I'll also make work with the rest of my systems, but that's just what I want to challenge. Well, more of a challenge than usual, I should say.
It's the Everest of phone systems. You have to make it work because it's there.
Exactly.
I feel like there's an interesting point of discussion in your sort of, at least as for the impression I'm getting of this sort of like personal for fun queer, almost like appropriation of business technology and style. I don't know what to say about that, but I feel like that's super interesting. Because I feel like that's sort of the reverse of what usually happens. You get like rainbow capitalism and all that. But this is sort of the opposite. You're taking something that was once businesses renting to other businesses, using, ridiculous jargon to keep other people out of the industry, and turning it into something you, one person, do for fun because you can, instead of to try and make a profit. I don't know. That's interesting.
That's a pretty good summary of what it all is. I even have a little internal name for the system that plays on telephone company terminology. So you'll have a tandem switch, which is where one switch connects a bunch of other switches usually, and that's where billing was done for long distance calling. And I've called my own network Gewt Tandem because it connects a bunch of phone switches that may or may not be across the country, currently just across California, and there's the one location in Canada where I've connected to a friend's network there, and it's entirely possible for the friend in Canada to call me here in the Bay and then route the call to a place elsewhere in California, just for fun.
Neat. I have no idea how you managed to set all of this stuff up, and I'm very impressed. I will leave it at that. So let's talk about the community around like retro technology and computing. So this was a topic that I think Gravis had a lot to say about. So Gravis doesn't participate too much in communities, but the impression I got is that there weren't a lot of like organized spaces outside of some group chats and things like that. Has the community changed in the past year? Are there more spaces that you all sort of operate and interest in together?
I would say a bit. I mean, I think the Discord has been sort of on the rise, and that sort of led to more sort of ad hoc, smaller communities. Like one I'm in is called like Retro Tech Furs, because it's, gotten small enough that we can now have a furry community of retro tech people, kind of thing. It's this kind of like smaller communities that are not have to be set up by a big complicated organization has kind of sort of like democratized the community sort of thing, which means you have more communities, they can be smaller, and that I think makes them more like accepting of people. I think when you have like a system or like a fandom rather, where there's like one big community that ends up being set up by someone who had the money to make a forum website and run it for years, and that can often sort of consolidate power kind of thing, and you get a lot of complicated dynamics between the groups because of that. Whereas now that we've got a lot of smaller communities, I think this has sort of made it a lot better of a community sort of thing. I think I, to some degree, sort of agree with Gravis about not really operating in communities. I think I tend to more find interesting people to follow, and I think of it as sort of a one-on-one kind of thing. Communities, I tend to be in them so that people can contact me and I can, follow up on something kind of thing. Because I think a lot of times the communities, you get into this sort of like, people are trying to show off about a thing, or like, look how big my collection is. And it's like, it's not really about how big your collection is. It's about the interesting things you're bringing to the community, to the conversation kind of thing. Not just that you have a lot of money in a storage unit.
With phone stuff, it's very complicated because there are some larger communities, but a lot lately in the past year and a half or so, there's been a case of a community breaking off from that, which also partially broke off from another community. And there was a little bit of infighting there for a short while, but that has died down, and there's just becoming smaller and smaller and smaller communities, and it's turning into a lot of cases where the smaller communities are starting to police their situation a little bit better and push out people less accepting of queer people. So that bit is at least happening in the communities, which is nice, except for in some of the larger communities where it's still a bunch of angry people that are just not that great at handling a community or moderating a community or making a community inviting. However, some of the smaller communities are definitely trying a lot harder to make their community a bit more welcoming, but like I said, due to some of the infighting, there can be a little bit of excess caution than usual, especially considering the people that try and enter some of the smaller communities are meant specifically to harass myself and my friends because we're queer. So the particular community there is definitely fighting back on that, but I'm still not in the larger community overall because I'm just not entirely certain how they'll handle stuff. But the smaller communities definitely handle things better.
And I think in like sort of the tech community, we're kind of at an era where, because of like just basically how long ago it's been for a lot of these things, we're kind of at a transition point generationally, where a lot of the people who were working on it at the time are kind of aging out of the community, and a lot of people now are sort of picking it up who are kind of too young to be into this stuff back when it was new, and that's sort of, I think, shifting the dynamics a lot right now, because like I know several people who are just getting into like maybe like writing games for DOS. And, that type of, that age of people tend to be a lot queerer than the people who were like, I was making DOS games back in 1992, or they're more openly queer kind of thing. So we're kind of at an interesting transition point, I think, where we're getting a much younger generation getting into these things as a interesting old thing, rather than people who are still around from back then. So it's kind of shifting the dynamics, and I think in a much better way.
So, when we talked to Gravis, he managed to link queerness very specifically to retro technology.
Actually, I would like to offer the specific quote.
Okay, go for it.
What's the Quoth the Lizard? What's queer about retro technology? Me, baby. He also gave a serious answer, but I felt like that was worth mentioning.
So yeah, would you say that retro technology is prone to being queer?
I would say like the fandom is a lot at this point, because I think a lot of it is basically people who didn't get the chance to be into this the first time. And that's the thing, is like, computing has always been a case of sort of gatekeeped things. Like back when it started, it was like all the women were programmers, which was great, except that was because they didn't think programming was an important job. They thought the important people were the mathematicians who made the formulas and then handed it off to the programmers who basically just typed it in, kind of thing. And it's like, then eventually we realized programming was important, and then we shoved all the women out, kind of thing. So it's like, now that we're at the point where a lot of this stuff has become more available, it's people who never got the chance to get into it are getting into it. And they're getting into it on their own terms, not because it's a big company that does it, which means that a lot of people who aren't necessarily going to fit into a IBM type situation where you got to have a buzz cut and wear a tie, they're now able to do all these cool things they wanted to do and were not allowed to. And that's really sort of opened it up. I mean, personally, I think the connection is less with retro technology and just technology in general. I mean, like, basically, because of where I grew up, rural North Carolina, and being homeschooled, I had, like, zero connection to anything queer whatsoever. The most I got was my mom telling me that, like, gay people were just trying to get to our kids kind of thing. So it's like, that's not helpful at all. But with the internet, I was basically able to find other viewpoints and learn things about, the world and myself that I was not going to be allowed to see. So technology in general gave me that opening to the world and let me understand these things. And that basically, it being the thing that opened my eyes to all this stuff is what, gave me that interest in it, that drive to keep learning about things. Because it's like, this was like a lifeline kind of thing.
With phones, there's absolutely a bunch of queer people involved with it. I'm trying to think of what else I can say that isn't mentioning details I shouldn't. I know a bunch of queer people that do phone stuff. We get along well together. We occasionally discuss queerness and phones. I wouldn't say there's entire queer groups that are just groups of queer people, but there are definitely large groupings of queer people in phones that are doing phone stuff. And I notice it a lot more in phone stuff than did when I was doing some of the higher-end, high-performance mainframey stuff I used to do. I still do that on the side. But I tend to notice a lot more queer people in phones. And I definitely feel a little bit more easily accepted in doing phone stuff than I did necessarily doing some of the older DEC hardware or IBM mainframey stuff. But which is a bit surprising considering you would expect someone that was more very strictly business and rigidly defined to not necessarily be as queer as the previous stuff I did, because it was also very business, but I don't know, it's just interesting.
Although, one thing I always like to point out to people, and it's a well-known fact, but I think it gets overlooked a lot, computers were basically invented by a gay man who wanted to stop the Nazis. And I think a lot of times when we think about computers, we kind of forget that fact. That's why my name is Turing. As
far as my recollection of history goes, you're not wrong.
All right, well, I think with that, it's time to move on to our performance showcase.
So, for this performance showcase, similar sort of to how we did it with Gravis, where we pulled one of Gravis's Twitter threads, we've got each a couple of things that Foone and Madeline have done. So, for Foone, we actually have something that I think is super duper cool. Foone has a big project involving a machine or a program called Copy Pro Control, if you'd like to explain that.
Yeah, what it is I've gotten some machines that are called Copy Pro 2000s. They're designed for floppy disk duplication. Like back in the 90s, if you wanted to make a game, you'd be able to make a bunch of duplicate copies of your game and sell them. And I've been basically reversing them so that instead of making a copy of one disk onto a bunch of blank disks, I can put in a bunch of disks with data on them and image them all for archival reasons. So as part of that, I've had to build this circuit board which will control the whole thing. Because I can't like reprogram the computer that's built into this thing, I've got to basically control it with my own systems. So I basically had to make a simple circuit board for this, and then I realized there's a lot of blank space on this thing, so I just put some funny messages on it, and then I keep having to make new revisions as I find new stuff and add more features, and each time I add more and more text, so the thing's slowly gotten weirder and more complicated as I've done it.
Yeah, so what I really like about this is that this is a very practical thing that basically turned into an art piece. I don't even think basically. I think it's fair to say that this is an art piece, given that I have considered buying one to display. So obviously this is a very visual thing, so there will be a link in the show notes so you can see this thing up close. But for the sake of, as I always do this, here's what I'll do. I will, I guess, just go through and read a bunch of the text on these things, we'll just do it randomly. But in terms of the physical device itself, it's a blue circuit board with circuit, not wires because it's a circuit board. I think the technical term is traces running across it. There's a bunch of silver ringed holes for where you connect things together, all that sort of stuff. If you've ever done an electronics thing, you probably know what this looks like. If not, just look at the tweet. So I'm just going to rapid fire read a bunch of this text because I feel like that's the way this is meant to be enjoyed. Am I correct on that? All right. Somebody start a timer and let's go.
Here's what we're doing here. You have when I say go, you have exactly 1 minute and 18 seconds. And in 1 minute and 18 seconds, you are going to read as many of these quotes as you can. 3, 2, 1, Go.
Remember Citadel, inject, reject sensor, disk in sensor, disk out sensor, inject, eject, motor, reject, solenoid, Kilroy was here, servo 1, servo 2, servo 3. This is part of a system of messages. We considered ourselves to be a powerful culture. This is not a place of honor. No highly esteemed deed is commemorated here. Nothing valued is here. These pins are a lie. This area intentionally left blank. You must agree to the GPL before connecting power. You can't cut back on copying floppies. You will regret this. Here there be dragons. 10K, 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 510. What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. Copy Pro Control 1.3 by Foone Turing 2019-1109. Watch out for flying USB cables. The owls are not what they seem. Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate. I'll trade a magic trick for a vase. Keep circulating the tapes. Turn down the lights where applicable. 1K. Juffo Wup fills in my fibers and I grow turgid. Violent action ensues. You shouldn't be here. 42. Front towards enemy. Do not eat. No user serviceable parts inside. Keep out of reach of children. Call Apogee. Say Ardwolf. Oh god, how did I get here? I am not good with electronics. Do not cover this hole. There's a no smoking sign. Floppy copier PCBs are known to the state of California to cause cancer. This is like maybe about 75% of all the text on the front and back of this board. I'm pretty proud of that.
I've not timed anyone yet, but I think you've put in a good speedrun attempt. We should definitely put this up on speedruns.com.
All right, well that was an adventure.
Oh dear.
So yeah, go look at this thing. I mean, maybe it's just because I'm an electronics nerd myself, but I think legitimately I would consider this thing art.
This thing is, no, you should look at this, regardless.
Yeah. And I think there's something really interesting about taking something so practical as like a control circuit and turning it into something so personal and expressive that I think, again, is very much the sort of thing that happens in these small, fractured queer communities of people who are interested in having their own explorations of old technology.
Definitely, yeah. Because I see a lot of other people making their own boards, and it's like, yeah, they put their name, the date, and maybe an email address on it, and it's like, come on, it's free to add all the text you want. Do something interesting with it.
All right, so we're also going to look at a series by Madeline called Foone Detected. Would you care to explain what Foone Detected is?
Okay, so Foone Detected is a really fun project of mine that's sort of a background reflex in my brain now. So I'll be watching a TV show or movie, and I'll see a phone. I will immediately take a screenshot of said phone, post it to Twitter, include Foone Detected, usually in all caps, not necessarily, and if I can, identify the phone. This also has an extension where if I'm out at a restaurant and I hear a phone ring, I will try to identify the phone from the ring and annoy all my friends by detailing what phone it was.
I can confirm that happens. We'll be out somewhere and I'll hear a phone in the distance and she goes, "Ooh, Nortel."
Okay, wait. what I'm going to do here. Oh, that's disappointing. Never mind.
I feel like we have the same idea here that's way better than what we were initially planning. And if you're thinking what I'm thinking, go to freesound.org and look up phone ring.
I was looking up landline phone, and I was gonna post pictures randomly off Google Images. But this way seems like we won't violate copyright.
I feel like for our audio medium podcast, I want to do some ring identification.
All right, yeah, let's see if, we'll see if this works.
Yeah, worst case, we'll fall on plan B.
All right, here's phone number 1. I don't know if these are real phones or not is the problem.
That's a real phone. I'm not entirely certain on that one. I can just tell it's a real phone.
Yeah, it's the kind that uses like the physical, actual bells.
Yeah, it's actual bells.
Recording.
I just can't tell if it's going to be Princess or... Because it doesn't sound like 2500 set, which would be... Nope, wrong number. So it's not that. It's not a 2500 set.
I'm keeping all of that audio in the episode, just so we're clear. But there, even if you're not sure exactly what model, we can be sure of one thing. Phone detected.
Yep.
All right, Kaylee, hit us with another one.
All right. And again, I still don't know if these are real phones or not, but here's another one. This is definitely the most seat of our pants performance showcase we've ever done, but I am loving it.
Classic office-ish telephone ringing. That sounds heavily processed, a little bit clipped, and potentially a weird British phone system. That's my initial guess, but I could be wrong.
So how certain are we on the phone detected? What is your guess? Is this phone or is this not a phone?
I'd wager it's a phone system of some sort, doing its ringback tone, but I'm not entirely certain.
Ooh, I found one that actually says which phone it's from, so this can be our grand finale here. The only problem is I need to find a way to link you. I'm gonna have to download the audio here to upload it, so that you can't see what the answer is.
Oh, you can do that easily from Freesound, so yeah.
So I'm gonna have to download this episode. I'm gonna have to pay like $3.
Will you?
I said free.
Oh, you said free.
Oh, I thought you said 3.
No, it's Freesound. It's not $3sound.org.
That would be a terrible website. Although now I kind of want to expand this idea out to a full game show where we play random noises at Madeline and say, like, was that a phone or not?
Okay.
And if so, which kind?
Here's your finale phone call, then.
Oh no, obviously a phone, digital of some sort, well, that sounds very early digital, not entirely certain. My guess would either be Panasonic, GE, or really, really, really late digital trim line.
I would guess it, I'm not good at this, but I wouldn't guess anyway, that it's a Nokia cell phone, because it sounds like the
could be, actually,
It sounds like the sound chip.
It does. Yeah. So either very early digital landline or cell phone.
All right, Kaylee.
I think, I don't know a lot about phones, but I think early digital landline is correct because it says it's an old Telecom NZ landline.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's kind of odd, but okay, that makes sense.
Well, there you have it. Phones have been detected.
Ooh, I found another one.
To give an example of how similar sort of geeks are, I do almost exactly the same thing, but with floppy disks.
Disk detected. Floppy disk detected.
Yeah, I have a relatively popular Tumblr, which is like anime floppies. It's just a bunch of times floppies have shown up in anime.
Okay, I lied. Bonus round. Here's the bonus round. This is for doubling your prize.
Okay, that is very definitely 500. I'm pretty sure it's either 500 set. No, that could be a... No, that's going to be larger bell, so that's probably going to be 500, 1500, maybe. I don't think a 302, but probably 500 set, I'd say.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a 1950s Western Electric 500 telephone.
Cool.
Well, yeah, no, I think that worked out pretty well as a performance showcase idea.
Anyway, let's get into our next segment, the listener questions. Now, we've kind of played with the format a little bit here. So we took a couple old questions, we took a new question, and we're gonna... so some of these are very old questions from Gravis's episode that we're gonna ask again, and one of them is a new question.
And you have to figure out which is which. No, I'm kidding.
And if it's a phone or not.
Anyway, if you would like to ask a question for us or our guests, you can email us at sendingtherecordqueer@gmail.com, join our Discord at bit.ly/strqcord, or ask us on Twitter at strqueercast. At Six Arm Sweater asks, back in the day, what supposedly obsolete technology deserves to make a comeback and why?
I could try to just be on brand and say floppies, but I don't actually think that's a good idea at this point. As for like obsolete technology, I think one thing we're kind of missing out in the sort of the modern era with like how a lot of computing works is that everything currently has a computer inside it, which kind of makes things very complicated and break in very odd ways. And I've talked about this before, that one amusing thing about stuff in the past is a lot of it, it's like, oh, I want to set up a computer. How do I do that? Well, I plug all these things in together. And once I plug them in, they all work. Then in the modern day, it's like, okay, let me see if I can get my Bluetooth to pair. Well, my Bluetooth won't pair. Let me reboot my phone and then the headphones and kind of things. It's like, it's all about, oh, I got to enter the PIN code to authenticate it. A lot of sort of the ideas of, not everything has a battery. They have a cable, and you plug the cables in, and that makes them work, is definitely something that I think was big in the old days, because it had to be, and I think should come back a bit more. I like a wired mouse. I never have to change the battery in my mouse, because it doesn't have batteries, kind of thing.
I agree with this assessment.
I absolutely feel the landline phone should make a comeback.
Really? Okay. I want you to pitch this to me.
So, you have a dedicated line to your house. That dedicated line will still work when the power is out because the central office phone switch will still have power. There's guaranteed rerouting for emergency services. It's guaranteed to also work reliably for backup internet when your internet's out. It's guaranteed to work over fairly long distances. Very long distances, come to think of it. And it's part of a network that was engineered to survive a nuclear war. So it's going to stay up, stay reliable, and you're not usually going to have too many issues with it. The downside is you can't travel with it, but that's what bringing back payphones is for. Just put a payphone in every restaurant. Problem solved.
I do like that the common thread here was, what if we did things that were convenient? Because sometimes I feel that modern technologies have forgotten that in some ways.
For sure.
Absolutely.
As someone who does a lot of retro tech and a lot of modern tech, it's often very annoying to see the contrasts. And like the old stuff was like more complicated and slower, but it kind of tended to work when it worked. Whereas the new stuff tends to sometimes just decide, I'm not going to work today. Why? I don't know. It's too complicated to figure that out.
All right, well, then we also have one brand new, fresh, hot off of the grill question from @EonTweets, who says, in thinking of a question, I realized just how much I would love to convert a speak and spell toy into a computer keyboard, which as a sidebar, I believe Foone has done. What toy or piece of old technology would you most like to get working with modern computers?
I haven't actually done a speak and spell yet, but I'm planning on it. What I want to do is I want to make a keyboard out of one of those spin and say things, where you pull the cord out and it goes, the cow says moo, kind of things, because they made alphabetical ones. So you basically have to like adjust it to the right thing, and it would say the whole message and then type that letter for you. That would be hilarious to me.
That sounds amazing.
I absolutely want a phone interface to this thing called a Texas Instruments language translator or language tutor, which is very early 1979 effective. Well, it's not speech synthesis because it's combining a bunch of pre-existing phrases and phonemes and whatnot. But I would love a phone interface for that because it has a preset list of words it can say in a different language. A lot of times the language may be English. I own 3 of the things and I have 4 different languages for it. It just has a very distinctive voice, very similar to the speak and spell. And it was featured in a Kraftwerk album at one point. And after listening to the album, I concluded, I need 3 of these things. So then I featured in, like, anytime I'm exploring weird musical experimentation or want to make a weird phone recording, I will grab one of these things. And I just want there to be a direct phone interface because I don't want to have to just hold a phone up to the speaker. I want to be able to just plug it into a phone and have it sound great and have it be controllable remotely. Like, you have to enter 26 for, say, a letter of the alphabet, or 1 for a different letter of the alphabet, maybe a number. I just want a phone interface to the thing, and that'd be really fun.
I don't have a good transition here, but it's time for Kaylee's question of the week.
Yay!
So, these are pretty normal questions, you know, the kind that you didn't remember saving in a document on the computer that you grew up with, but when you go back to check it out, in a fit of nostalgia, there it is, just asking you, plain as day, text document, 1 sentence, asking you a question. What we're going to do this time is we're going to take the question that we asked way back in episode 2, and there's a part 2 to the question now. We're not going to answer until after we've had part 1. Also, Alexis and I are not going to give the same answer we gave back then.
Joke's on you, I don't remember my answer.
I don't either, even though we just listened to the episode back yesterday. Don't remember. So, part 1 of the question is, if you were a retro computer, what kind of features would you have?
My answer's simple. Very, very little memory.
I would absolutely be a PDP-10 in a pretty similar configuration to that of the Stanford AI Lab. A robotic arm, have weird ability to display images and video in the 70s and 80s, have a complicated network interface, have like multiple computers operating as one, have an expansive amount of disk drives made them a different vendor, last for a very, very, very long time, way past the heyday of said machine. Basically, I want to be Sale. The name of the system.
I would run TurboGrafx games and use TurboGrafx accessories. That's it. Just TurboGrafx.
See, I feel like for you, Kaylee, you just need to be a machine learning network that comes up with questions.
That's not retro.
Oh, that's fair. I remember struggling to come up with a good answer to this question last time, and I'm still in that position. Actually, in the spirit of the original episode was with Gravis, I am going to make my stance on an opinion that I got from and share with Gravis. If I were a retro computer, I would be one from before they invented mice, because, I kind of hate mice.
All right, now, the hidden part 2 of this question. If instead of just being the retro computer, you were a cyborg that was part human, part that type of retro computer, how would you use your retro computer half to fight crime?
Well, if I'm old enough to not have a mouse, I'm also old enough to have a big unwieldy CRT monitor, so I'm just going to use my face as a hammer.
I'm just going to tempt him over with those top-of-the-line TurboGrafx games. And then when they're there, it's like, bam, I caught you, crime doers.
I'm going to have all the relevant case records and, special skills on floppy disk that I can just swap in and out. I need to know jujitsu for this case. Let me swap this in here. Basically the Matrix, but made 10 years earlier.
Well, like I said, I'd have a robotic arm, so I would basically... Oh, wait. I would also have control of a weird remote-controlled car. I could use that to distract people. I think Sale had a remote-controlled car. That's something similar to that. I know it's related to the project.
To crush them with your arm and then run them over with your car?
Exactly. The tiny remote-controlled car. So long as the crime is a mouse, I'm perfectly sorted. Well, sorry, something the size of a mouse.
Yeah, you can also handle several insects, spiders, rats. You've got it covered. Smaller guinea pigs.
Rodent and insect crime division.
Exactly.
There's a bunch of newt crimes, occasional voles.
I'm sorry, did you say newt crimes?
Yes.
Okay.
It's different from nude crimes.
All right, well, I think that about does it for this episode of Setting the Record Queer.
You heard it here first, friends. Newt crimes are different than nude crimes.
Although there is a lot of overlap.
Oh no, I mean, I've never seen a newt wearing clothes, so I guess that's valid.
Exactly. And if you do, smash it with your robotic arm.
If you have an answer to this question of the week, then you can send it to us through any of the methods we listed earlier, and if it's our favorite, we'll read it on next week's episode.
All right, and with that, with the distinction or lack thereof between newt crimes and nude crimes firmly planted in your conscience, now you know, now you have learned, now you can be aware and safe. Now we can end the episode, I think. Now that we've gotten there. So, Foone and Madeline, where can our listeners find you and your, work and interests?
I'm on Twitter at Foone and Foone.org.
How's that spelled?
Foone.
Great.
I am Gewt, or Madeline Autumn Rose. You can find me at Gewt, Gewt, on Twitter, or you can find my art and my various writings at dev.gimme-sympathy.org, dev.gimme-sympathy.org.
All right. So be sure to go back and listen to episode 2 with Gravis if you haven't already. It was great, and I think these 2 episodes will pair together quite nicely, like floppy disks and sarcastic circuit board prints, or newts and lives of crime, apparently. So if you enjoyed this podcast, and hopefully you sat down and enjoyed episode 2 as well, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/settingtherecordqueer. Our patrons can get early guest reveals, access to a special patrons-only Discord channel, high quality or early episodes, and even special thanks on the show. We'd like to give our thanks to our $25 patron, Jane, who you can find on Twitter as @CallMeCadejo. That's @CallMeCadejo. As well, we are still sort of thinking about and reevaluating some of our Patreon tiers, so if there's anything you'd like to get out of supporting this podcast financially, please let us know. We want this to be something worthwhile to our listeners. Otherwise, besides Patreon, though, if you liked this podcast, please subscribe or leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Tell a friend about us or recommend us on your social media. You can find us on Twitter at STRQueercast, via email settingtherecordqueer@gmail.com, or you can come hang out in our Setting the Record Queer community Discord at bit.ly/STRQcord. That's all lowercase. While you're in any of those places, feel free to ask questions for us or for our guests, or give us feedback about the show. Maybe you have a cool idea for who or what could be on this podcast. Maybe you think you should be on this podcast. We would love to hear from you, and we are always looking for ideas. Our favorite answer to last week's Kaylee's question of the week, which was, besides body horror, what other body genres would you like to see? Was body cyberpunk, a bleak dystopian future where advances in technology blur the line between machinery and the Oh wait, that's just cyberpunk. And that was from Amelia in the Discord. The logo for this podcast was drawn by Cubotic. That's at QBTIC on Twitter, or Cobot, QOBOT.tumblr.com. The theme music and production for the show is done by Thrill Me Music. You can find more information about her work at thrillmemusic.squarespace.com. Kaylee, where can our listeners find you?
People can find me on Twitter at WitchesHex. That's WITCHS Hex. You can also follow SoulSync's development at SoulSync Game. That's SOULSYNC Game. Again, I did like a whole 45-minute video on the game so far and how it's going and what's in it. So you can check that out. It's on that Twitter.
And you can find me on Twitch and Twitter as Double Gear Sys. That's Double Gear SYS as in system. And you can find my Final Fantasy XIV virtual photography and such shenanigans at Instagram.com/echo_white. That's EKHO_white as in the color. Our next episode is going to be about education and school programming. And with that, we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to go check out my Taking the Minutes on text painting. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.